People call each other stupid so casually that it barely registers anymore. It happens in politics, in workplaces, in families, everywhere. And the strange part isn't that the accusation is common. It's that everyone seems equally confident that they're the one seeing things clearly. When a pattern shows up this consistently, it usually means the explanation people reach for, they're just stupid, isn't actually doing any explanatory work. It's a placeholder for something we haven't identified yet. People aren't seeing the same problem. Most disagreements start long before anyone opens their mouth. They start with what each person notices. Human attention is selective, and not in a poetic way, in a literal, mechanical way. We only register a tiny fraction of what's happening around us, and what we notice depends on what we care about, what we've learned to look for, and what we're trying to accomplish. Two people can stand in the same room, look at the same situation, and walk away with entirely different impressions. Not because one of them is blind, but because they were each filtering the scene through different priorities. One person sees risk, another sees opportunity. One sees a pattern they've encountered before, another sees a detail that matters only to them. Each person builds a simplified version of the situation, not because they're lazy, but because the full complexity of the world is too large to hold in any working memory. These simplified versions feel complete from the inside, but outside, someone else's version looks like they're missing something obvious. But that obvious thing is only obvious because you were trained to look for it. Once you see this mismatch, the constant accusations of stupidity start to make more sense. People aren't reacting to the same problem. They're reacting to the version of the problem their minds constructed. Stupid is a useless hypothesis. If people are working from different internal models, then calling someone stupid doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't explain their behavior. It doesn't help you predict what they'll do next. It doesn't give you any levers to work with. It just shuts down the analysis. A more useful stance is to assume that every actor is acting rationally to the incentives and constraints in their environment. This doesn't mean everyone is equally intelligent. It simply means that behavior follows from some internal logic, and if you can uncover that logic, the behavior becomes understandable. This isn't a charitable interpretation, it's a practical one. Treating someone as stupid gives you nothing. Treating them as rational gives you a starting point. It lets you ask, what pressures are they under? What outcomes are they trying to avoid? What resources do they lack? What risks do they see that I don't? Stupid is a dead end. Rational under different constraints is a solvable problem. Disagreement as strategy, not IQ. Once rationality is the default assumption, disagreement stops looking like a failure of intelligence. It starts looking like a clash of strategies. Two people can look at the same situation and make opposite choices because they're not optimizing for the same thing. One might be trying to survive till next month, another might be trying to stabilize the next decade. One might be protecting a fragile coalition, another might be trying to signal independence. One might be minimizing risk, another might be maximizing upside. Even when they're looking at the same facts, those facts sit inside different strategic contexts. A move that looks reckless to someone protecting long-term stability can be perfectly rational for someone trying to avoid immediate collapse. A move that looks timid to someone optimizing for moral clarity can be rational for someone trying to keep a volatile group from splintering. Once you understand that people are solving different problems, the mystery evaporates. The disagreement isn't about who's smarter, it's about which strategy each person is running and what constraints that strategy forces them to honor. Why every decision disappoints someone. Every decision has a cost that isn't visible from the outside. When an actor chooses one path, they are also choosing not to take every other path available to them. Those abandoned paths aren't abstract. Each one represents an outcome that someone in the system wanted, expected, or depended on, which means even a well-reasoned decision will inevitably disappoint someone. This is the part most observers miss. They assume a good decision should satisfy all interests at once, as if trade-offs were optional. But in any complex environment, objectives collide. Improving one dimension almost always worsens another. A move that strengthens long-term stability might damage short-term performance. A policy that benefits the system as a whole might undermine a faction that relies on the current arrangement. From the outside, it's easy to say, why didn't they just do X? But X is never free. Choosing X means not choosing Y, Z, and everything else that someone else considers essential. The actor isn't optimizing for a single outcome. They're navigating a landscape where gains in one area require losses in another. The trade-offs are built into the structure of the situation, not into the intelligence of the decision-maker. This is why opportunity cost sits at the center of the "everyone else is stupid" phenomenon. People judge decisions as if all desirable outcomes could be achieved simultaneously. When they can't, the decision-maker looks incompetent, malicious, or blind to the obvious. In reality, they are confronting the basic constraint that no action can satisfy all competing demands at once. Opportunity cost guarantees that every decision produces winners and losers, and therefore critics. It's not a failure of intelligence. It's the architecture of choice. When strategy and opportunity cost collide. International development provides a clean example of how strategy and opportunity cost shape behavior. When a corruption-heavy country receives outside funding and nothing improves, the usual reaction is to say the aid wasn't enough. If the outcome didn't change, the reasoning goes, more resources must be required, and if donors hesitate, they're blamed for the continued failure. That interpretation only makes sense if the country is trying to optimize for national development, but many systems aren't built around that goal. If the dominant internal strategy is extraction, where those in power benefit from diverting resources to themselves and their networks, then development isn't just a low priority, it's a threat. Using new funds for broad prosperity would require the ruling group to weaken the very mechanisms that keep them in power. Strengthening institutions, improving transparency, or investing in public goods might look obviously beneficial from the outside, but inside the system, they can destabilize the existing power structure. Seen from that vantage point, diverting aid isn't irrational. It's consistent with a strategy optimized for maintaining control in a low-trust environment. Additional money doesn't change the incentives. It simply increases the amount of fuel available to the existing strategy. That is why some observers eventually conclude that external funding can't fix the problem. The issue isn't the amount of money, it's the strategy the system is running. A strategy built for extraction cannot produce the outcomes outsiders expect, no matter how much money is added. This example shows how strategy and opportunity cost combine to create decisions that look misguided from the outside, but are coherent within the system that generates them. Not all strategies build a first-world outcome. Once the everyone is stupid story is stripped away, what's left isn't a morality play. It's a landscape of competing strategies. And the crucial thing about strategies is they don't all produce the same kind of world. Some are built for short-term extraction, some for long-term stability, some for personal security, some for broad prosperity, some only function in low-trust environments, while others require high-trust environments to work at all. When you see this, the central question shifts. The issue isn't why certain actors fail to pursue outcomes that seem obvious from the outside. The issue is that their strategy is optimized for a completely different set of incentives and constraints. A strategy designed for survival inside a fragile or corrupt system will not and cannot generate the characteristics associated with a first-world economy. No amount of external pressure or funding can force a strategy to produce an outcome it was never built to deliver. This is the real pivot point. If different strategies produce different worlds, then the useful question isn't why don't they understand, it's which strategies reliably generate the high-trust, high-prosperity environment we claim to want. The conflicts people interpret as ignorance or malice are often deeper disagreements about which strategic model should govern the system. People can keep calling each other stupid if they want, but the insult hides the actual dispute. Beneath the surface, the fight is about strategy selection, about which approach will shape the future, and what kind of society that approach is capable of producing. In other words, not all strategies are equal. But hey, I'm just a meat tuber with a degree in ruining things, so that's all the time I've got. But if you'd like me to explain in detail, let me know in the comments.